What really happens when the Pope dies, inside the sealed walls of Vatican City? That's not just a question. It's the start of a mystery so tightly wrapped in centuries of tradition, political power, and ancient secrecy, that not even most cardinals know the full truth. The story begins on a quiet Sunday morning. Rome was calm. The Vatican gardens were kissed by the golden light of dawn. Pilgrims wandered St. Peter's Square, whispering prayers, unaware that something inside those ancient stone walls had just changed forever. But something was wrong. The bell, the one that rings when the Pope dies, never sounded. No smoke. No public announcement. Just silence. In Vatican protocol, a papal death sets off a precise chain of ancient rituals. The Cardinal Camerlengo confirms the death, seals the papal apartments, and summons the College of Cardinals. White smoke eventually signals a new beginning. But today, nothing happened. Somewhere in the depths of the Apostolic Palace, the world's most powerful spiritual leader had just stopped breathing. And yet, the world was still turning, blissfully unaware. So ask yourself, what if the world wasn't told because it wasn't allowed to know? Hit subscribe and comment below where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? At exactly 6:42 a.m. Vatican time, an internal Vatican server flagged an emergency. A silent alert was triggered, a system so deeply embedded in centuries of Vatican tech secrecy, it was designed to bypass public knowledge entirely. 3 people received that alert. The Camerlengo, the head of Vatican security, and a cardinal known only to a handful outside the Holy See, Cardinal Agustin de Silva, the architect behind Vatican Black protocols. But there was a 4th person who got wind of it, through means even the Vatican couldn't anticipate. Thousands of miles away, in a glass-walled office in Austin, Texas, Elon Musk was mid-call with a SpaceX director when his neural AI assistant pinged. Alert, Black Channel Anomaly. Source, Vatican. Subroutine, Death Protocols. Priority 1 match. Elon leaned back in his chair, narrowed his eyes, and stared at the display. Vatican, he whispered. Why would the Black Channel fire from the Vatican? Most people wouldn't care. Elon wasn't most people. Meanwhile, inside the Vatican's papal apartments, Father Michael Caruso stood just outside the sealed chamber. He was young for his role, only 37, an American-born priest whose quick wit and Latin fluency had fast-tracked him through Vatican ranks. He wasn't supposed to be here. But the nun who'd cleaned the papal linens that morning had collapsed in shock, whispering only, he's gone, before being escorted away. Michael had seen the body. He had seen the bruises. The papal physician had written natural causes, a quiet passing in the early hours. But Michael wasn't buying it. What disturbed him most wasn't the death. It was the cover-up. The bell, crafted centuries ago by monks and meant to ring only once per pope, remained still in the belfry. There was no movement in St. Peter's. The Swiss guards hadn't even tightened protocol. There was no conclave scheduled. No announcement. Nothing. Only one word buzzed through the corridors of the Vatican that morning. Contained. Back in Texas, Elon sat in a Tesla parked in a private lab. He wasn't in the mood to wait. He pulled out a secure tablet, opened a deep web link routed through multiple Starlink satellites, and accessed a project even SpaceX board members didn't know existed, Project Vox Day. Vox Day was Elon's personal side venture, an AI designed to interpret religious, philosophical, and mythological events through the lens of geopolitics and quantum pattern analysis. A digital voice spoke. Confirmed anomaly. Vatican protocol death chain was triggered, then, halted. Timeline deviation detected. Elon raised an eyebrow. By who? Unknown. But the event fits criteria. False death announcement probability exceeds 72%. He tapped the console. Run Vatican scenario simulation. Parameters, death of a pope. No public acknowledgement. Predict next 72 hours. Simulation running. Output ETA, 13 minutes. Then, he opened Twitter. Or rather, his personal tweet manager, preloaded drafts, automated engagement triggers, and code-level control. He typed only 4 words. The bell didn't ring. That was all. But within minutes, the post went viral. In Vatican City, Father Michael walked alone through the marbled halls beneath the Sistine Chapel. His footsteps echoed like thunder in the silence. He approached a shadowed door marked with 3 letters burned into old wood, SPF, Sanctum Papali Finalis. He had no key. He wasn't even sure if it opened anymore. But he had questions. And questions, he'd learned, are dangerous currency in a place built on absolutes. Later that night, across the world, people began asking questions. YouTubers posted conspiracies. Redditors dissected the silence. TikTok exploded with edits of the papal balcony, empty. And one tweet kept getting quoted. The bell didn't ring. At Elon Musk. Was it a glitch? A malfunction? Or a message? It wasn't the kind of message you ignore. Subject line, he's gone. But they won't say. From, an encrypted Proton mail address traced to somewhere in Rome. Elon Musk stared at the email. The timestamp? Exactly 7:06 a.m. Vatican time, 24 minutes after the Black Channel anomaly pinged his private AI system. He didn't recognize the sender's name. No one would. The account was created 2 hours before the message was sent. But the phrasing, the tone, it triggered something deep inside him. Something beyond curiosity. He clicked the email open. There was no text. Just a single attachment, a photo of the papal signet ring, cracked down the center. The ring of the fisherman is only ever destroyed when a pope dies. It is shattered in ceremony, in front of the world, during a ritual passed down since the 13th century. But this wasn't a ceremony. This wasn't tradition. This was a warning. Elon wasn't religious. He was baptized Anglican but never practiced. He believed in probability, not prophecy. Yet, deep down, he knew power when he saw it. And the Vatican, ancient, secretive, self-contained, was one of the last institutions on Earth more powerful than the algorithm. He slid into his midnight blue Model S Plaid and pulled out of the SpaceX lot. The hum of the electric motor was smooth as a whisper. The car drove itself down I-35, headed toward his private tech compound outside Austin. As the car moved, Elon pulled up the Vatican's official news feed. Nothing. No announcements. No press briefings. No mention of the Pope. He checked the live Vatican webcam train 24/7 on St. Peter's Square. Empty. No crowds. No Swiss guards. Just a breeze blowing faintly through the colonnades. He tapped into Vox Day again. Update, pattern inconsistency detected in 8 Vatican-based Twitter accounts. All accounts stopped posting within a 3-minute window between 6:39 and 6:42 a.m. Rome time. Elon whispered to himself, that's when he died. But what chilled him most wasn't that the Pope had died. It was that no one had said a word. This wasn't just a cover-up. This was suppression on a global scale. Inside the Vatican, Father Michael sat in the shadowed recesses of the archives room, lit only by the flickering flame of an oil lamp, a tradition in this section of the building where electricity was forbidden. He was holding a folder marked Ordo Mortis Pontificis, Order of the Pope's Death. It wasn't meant for him. But no one had stopped him either. The protocol inside described in chilling detail the exact moment the Pope's death is verified. 1. The Pope is called by his birth name 3 times. 2. His eyes are closed with a silk cloth woven in gold thread. 3. A silver hammer strikes his forehead gently 3 times. 4. A physician signs the death certificate. 5. The ring is broken in front of senior cardinals. 6. The bell is rung for the city to hear. None of it had happened. But the cracked ring had surfaced. Somehow, somewhere, outside of Vatican control. Who sent it? And how had Musk seen it so fast? Michael tucked the file under his robe and exited the room, heart pounding. Back in Texas, Elon's phone buzzed. Private message, Cardinal Augustine de Silva. He blinked. That name hadn't appeared in years. De Silva was a secretive figure known for his reformist views, and for disappearing from public sight after a major scandal in 2015. The message was brief. You don't know what you've started. But maybe you're the only one who can finish it. There are people inside who want out. The bell didn't ring because they never let him die. Attached was a location pin, Rome. Elon let the message sit for a second. Then he opened his secure app, tapped a single command labeled, Exodus. The AI assistant's voice chimed in the car. Confirming private jet departure to Rome. Wheels up in 57 minutes. The Vatican is old. But not dumb. By the time Elon's jet was climbing above the Gulf of Mexico, a Vatican communications officer had flagged his tweets. A second officer flagged the increased search traffic on Vatican Death Protocol, and a third escalated the anomaly to Cardinal de Silva. Except de Silva was no longer part of their system. He was inside. But not with them. And he had just committed a heresy more dangerous than any doctrine, leaking the truth. Michael stood in the Vatican's north courtyard and stared up at the cloudy sky. He reached into his coat and pulled out an old relic, his father's military compass. A nod to the past. A reminder that truth doesn't always point north. A colleague approached him, Father Jacoby. You've been asking questions, Jacoby said, quiet, almost apologetic. Michael didn't reply. They're watching, you know. They know you've seen the ring. Michael slipped the compass back into his pocket. Then let them watch. Meanwhile, somewhere over the Atlantic, Elon Musk poured himself a glass of water, leaned back in the leather seat, and stared at a Vatican map glowing on his tablet. I don't believe in fate, he muttered. But I believe in systems. And something about this one, just broke. The Vatican is built on secrets. Not the kind that fade with time, but the kind etched in marble, hidden in locked drawers, whispered in Latin through candlelit corridors. And now, one of its oldest secrets was unraveling, on Twitter. The bell didn't ring. At Elon Musk. A single tweet. No explanation. No context. But the world had seen it. Within hours, Reddit threads bloomed like wildfire. TikTok conspiracy channels posted side-by-sides of previous papal deaths, overlaid with grainy footage from the quiet, cloud-covered balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. Where there should have been smoke, there was nothing. And then came the audio file. Uploaded anonymously, it spread through encrypted Telegram channels and underground Catholic forums. A 7-second clip, no video, just a voice, old and trembling. He was trying to write a letter. They stopped him. The bell, we were told not to ring it. Father Michael Caruso listened to the clip at 2:13 a.m. from a borrowed phone. His hands were shaking. The voice, it sounded familiar. He replayed it. Again. And again. Then it clicked. It was Monsignor Vito, an archivist in his 80s, nearly blind, who hadn't left the Vatican library in decades. Michael had studied under him as a seminarian. Vito was old school, loyal, formal, absolutely devoted to Vatican protocol. He would never, ever speak out, unless something had gone terribly wrong. Michael didn't sleep that night. The next morning, while Rome stirred slowly under a gray sky, a Tesla Model S with diplomatic plates rolled through the heavily guarded entrance of the Vatican embassy. Elon Musk stepped out, wearing a black suit with no tie. His eyes scanned everything, stonework, guards, security cameras, even the birds on the rooftops. He had that look in his eyes again. The one that said he wasn't just observing. He was calculating. Inside, he met with Cardinal Gregory Hayes, a U.S. cardinal on unofficial sabbatical. Hayes was the kind of man who wore his conscience like armor. He'd clashed with Rome years ago over abuse cover-ups and reforms. The Vatican didn't forget. They just buried people like him in advisory roles. He wasn't expecting Elon. "You're not exactly subtle," Hayes said. "I'm not trying to be," Elon replied. "And I think they're counting on subtlety. That's their problem." Hayes poured 2 espressos. "They'll never let the truth out, you know. Not fully. There are things buried here that could unmake faith itself. Then maybe it needs to be remade." Hayes gave a tired smile. "You really believe that?" "I believe in disruption," Elon said. "And I believe the system glitched. When that happens in software, you trace the source code. Find the line that broke the logic." He paused. "That bell was a system call. Someone suppressed it. I want to know who." Meanwhile, deep inside the Vatican's Archivum Secretum, Michael descended into the catacombs beneath the Apostolic Palace. A former janitor turned custodian, Brother Leo, met him at a rusted gate. "You have 5 minutes," Leo whispered. "And if I get caught, I'll be scrubbing floors in Morocco." Michael nodded. The chamber was silent and cold. He stepped forward, running his fingers along the spines of leather-bound ledgers and crumbling scrolls. He stopped in front of one that looked newer than the others. A thin, black binder marked Petrus Mortis, 2025. Peter is dead. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of parchment. "Not verified. Do not disclose. Initiate phase, Umbra. Await confirmation from CPF. CPF. Conclave Preparatory Force, a body so secret, even most cardinals didn't know it existed. Its only function, manage unpredictable transitions." Michael's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about death. It was about control. Elon was doing his own digging. With encrypted Starlink uplinks, he accessed old Vatican camera footage archived on European backup satellites. He ran a timestamp search, 6:39 a.m. to 6:45 a.m., April 19, 2025. The system returned exactly one frame that hadn't been purged, a grainy snapshot of the Pope in bed, surrounded by 2 unidentified men, one holding a black leather satchel. Elon enhanced the image. The satchel bore a crest, 2 crossed keys beneath a 7-pointed star. Not Vatican standard. He'd seen it before. Camerlengo Protocol Force. Internal enforcers of papal law, created centuries ago to manage crises. Officially disbanded in 1958. Unofficially, still active. That night, Elon posted again. "Sometimes the oldest secrets wear the newest robes." At Elon Musk. The comments section exploded. "Is the Pope alive? Bro, what if he was taken out by his own guards? Did Elon just declare war on the Catholic Church?" One reply stood out. An account created just days before, with a profile picture of a ring, broken. "They're watching you. Check beneath the papal crypt. The tomb is empty. Beneath the polished marble and gilded gold of the Vatican lies a world few ever see, a labyrinth of tunnels, archives, hidden chapels, and locked vaults. It's older than the church itself. Some say it was once a Roman catacomb. Others whisper it's been used for centuries to keep the truth buried, literally." Father Michael Caruso didn't believe in ghosts. But as he stepped deeper into the undercroft beneath the papal crypt, even he had to admit, the air felt haunted. He followed the directions sent to him via a burner phone left in his quarters that morning, no note, just a GPS coordinate and the Latin phrase, Veritas sub terra dormit. Truth sleeps beneath the earth. The pathway led him through a corridor with flickering gas lamps, past a locked chamber where old papal robes were kept. The smell of stone, parchment, and candle soot filled his lungs. He paused at a thick iron door that looked like it hadn't been opened in 100 years. He knocked once. Then twice. Then 3 times, slow and even. A panel slid open. A single eye appeared. Then a voice. Sanctus. Michael responded, Lux in tenebris. The door creaked open. Inside, 5 people stood around a round table, each wearing a black robe marked with a crimson cross. At the center of the table, an ancient relic, half of a silver bell, broken clean down the middle. The group called themselves Sanctus, an underground network of Vatican scholars, ex-priests, theologians, and even a few current insiders who believed the church had veered too far from its origins. Their purpose? Not to destroy the church, but to restore its truth. The leader, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, stepped forward. You must be Father Caruso. He nodded. You sent the phone. No, she said, but someone wants you here. And by now, so does he. Michael stiffened. The Pope? The woman, she introduced herself as Lucia Valenti, once a high-ranking Vatican researcher, nodded. He was trying to leak something before they got to him. A document. A speech. We think it was his resignation letter. Michael's pulse jumped. He was going to step down. Not step down, Lucia said. Expose the CPF and disband the conclave system. End the tradition of hereditary power within the papacy. Michael took a breath. That's ecclesiastical suicide. Or salvation, Lucia replied. Depends on which side of the truth you stand. Back in Rome, Elon Musk moved quietly through a darkened corridor under the U.S. Embassy to the Holy See. He wasn't alone. Cardinal Hayes walked beside him, holding a flash drive. This is everything I could pull before they purged the servers, Hayes said. Encrypted memos, witness reports, even footage from the apostolic apartments. Elon plugged the drive into his private device and ran it through his proprietary AI filter. One image caught his attention, a blurry frame showing a white-robed figure being moved in a wheelchair, under heavy guard, 2 hours after the Pope was officially listed as deceased in the Vatican's internal logs. Elon zoomed in on the timestamp. 8:45 a.m. He wasn't dead, Elon muttered. Or they didn't want him to be yet, Hayes said. Inside the Sanctus chamber, Michael reviewed handwritten transcripts from the last papal address that was never broadcast. One line stood out. The light of the church must never again be eclipsed by its shadows. No man should rule forever by silence. Lucia watched him read. He was going to give that on Easter Sunday, she said. Then the CPF showed up 3 days before. No one's seen him since. But I saw the body, Michael whispered. Did you see his face? His eyes? Did you touch him? Michael looked up. No. Lucia leaned in. Then you didn't see him. You saw what they wanted you to see. Back in the embassy, Elon received a text from an encrypted number. They know you're in Rome. You have 36 hours before the CPF makes its move. He turned to Hayes. How deep does this go? Hayes didn't blink. Deep enough that there's a second conclave being prepared, underground. No smoke. No votes. Just an anointing. You mean a replacement? Elon asked. Hayes nodded. More like a reboot. That night, Father Michael stepped back into the Vatican City Square. It was raining, quiet, the air heavy with tension. His phone buzzed. A new message. Anonymous. If you want the truth, follow the bloodline. Attached was an image of a child's birth certificate. The father's name, Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman. The ancient name from the prophecy of Saint Malachi, said to signal the final pope. But the pope had no children. No heirs. No family. Unless he did. Michael's heart skipped. What if the death of the Pope wasn't about the end of power, but about who inherits it next? The papal crypts beneath St. Peter's Basilica are among the most sacred places on earth. Generations of popes rest there, beneath layers of marble and centuries of silence. Tourists visit daily, pausing in reverence. But there's one tomb that no one is allowed to see without clearance, the current pope's. Except now, it was empty. Father Michael Caruso stood in the low-lit chamber, his breath clouding slightly in the cold underground air. He had bypassed 2 security checkpoints using an old clergy clearance badge still recognized by the Swiss Guard, and a small favor from Lucia Valenti. But nothing prepared him for the sight before him. The tomb slab marked with the Pope's name, Leo XIV, had been removed. No flowers. No candle. No sign of a body. Just stone. A Vatican gravedigger, an old man named Enzo, stood behind him silently, wringing his cap in his hands. Michael turned, voice low. "Did you do this?" "No, Father," Enzo whispered. "They brought him down, then took him away. No announcement. No rites." "When?" "3 nights ago. That was the night the bell was supposed to ring." In a secure apartment near the Spanish Steps, Elon Musk stared at the holographic projection of a Vatican blueprint. The system highlighted one particular path, a rarely used corridor beneath the Apostolic Palace, labeled only as Via Umbra. It led from the Pope's private quarters, to the CPF headquarters. "They moved him," Elon said aloud. Across from him, Cardinal Hayes nodded. "We believe he's alive. But barely. Sedated, hidden." "Why not just kill him?" Elon asked. "Because a dead pope can't abdicate," Hayes replied. "But a silent one? A controlled one? He becomes a puppet. And then, so does the Church." Elon pulled up the digital scan of the birth certificate Michael had found. The name Petrus Romanus glowed faintly on the screen. "The prophecy of Malachi," he said. "The final pope." Hayes exhaled. "If this is real, if this child exists, it could mean the line didn't end with Leo XIV. It's a bloodline. An heir." Elon looked out the window toward the Vatican skyline. "Then the Church doesn't just have a cover-up on its hands," he said. "It has a succession crisis." Back under the basilica, Michael examined the interior of the tomb chamber. A thin residue of holy oil marked the stone, not yet dried. That confirmed it, someone had anointed the body. But not for burial. He noticed something else. A small silver key, tucked behind a loose brick near the altar. He picked it up. On its handle, the Latin words. Custos Veritatis. Keeper of the truth. Suddenly, the air shifted. A faint movement. Footsteps. Michael turned. 2 Swiss guards stood at the entrance to the crypt. "This area is restricted, Father," one said. Michael's voice stayed calm. "I'm here under direct authorization of Cardinal Augustine de Silva." The guards hesitated. "We weren't told," the second said. "You weren't meant to be," Michael replied. He tucked the key into his sleeve and walked past them, heart pounding. Lucia waited for him at a small chapel outside the Vatican walls, one known only to insiders, Chapel of the Unseen Saints. It was where whistleblowers, reformists, and rebels within the Church met in secret, though they'd never call themselves that. Michael handed her the key. She gasped. "This hasn't been seen in decades." "What does it open?" he asked. She stepped back and pointed to an old iron door behind the altar. "That." Michael blinked. "We're going in now." "No," she said. "We're going in at midnight." "Why then?" "Because," she said, eyes steady, "that's when the CPF resets its watch system. And if we're wrong, we only have 60 seconds before we vanish too." Elsewhere in Rome, Elon received another encrypted message. This one had no text. Just a video. He tapped play. It showed a man, frail, pale, breathing heavily, being held up by two cloaked figures. It was blurry, but unmistakable. Pope Leo XIV. The video was timestamped from a mobile phone, and geotagged under Vatican Hill. Elon stared at the screen, mouth tightening. They're keeping him alive. But why? Midnight came. Michael and Lucia stood before the iron door in the chapel of the Unseen Saints. The key trembled slightly in Michael's hand as he inserted it. With a groan of ancient gears, the door unlocked. Behind it, a spiral staircase descending into blackness. Lucia lit a lantern. Ready? Michael nodded. We're already in too deep. As they descended, the air grew colder. The stone walls closed in. Candles flickered in old sconces carved with names, Latin inscriptions, lists of popes long erased from official records. Then they reached it, a hidden chamber, filled with parchments, relics, and at its center, a glass coffin. Inside lay, another pope. But it wasn't Leo XIV. Lucia covered her mouth. No. Michael leaned in. The body was well preserved. The face, unmistakable from old photographs. This is Pope Benedict XVI, he whispered. Lucia turned pale. But, he died in 2022. They buried him. Then who did they bury? Back on the surface, Elon's phone buzzed again. This time it was a voice message. A voice he recognized. Mr. Musk, this is Leo XIV. If you're hearing this, I'm not dead. And what they've done, what they're planning, must never see daylight. Click. If you're hearing this, I'm not dead. The words echoed through Elon's hotel suite like a divine whisper, not a confession, but a summons. The Pope's voice wasn't just a message. It was a warning, and a code. Elon sat still for a long moment, letting the implications settle. The Pope was alive. Sedated. Hidden. Probably against his will. And somehow, he'd gotten a message out, a voice memo encrypted with quantum lock watermarking, a format used only on secure Vatican channels. The same watermark was once embedded in papal election documents. Which meant someone on the inside helped him. Meanwhile, beneath the chapel, Father Michael and Lucia stood in stunned silence before the glass coffin containing the real body of Pope Benedict XVI, perfectly preserved. Lucia brushed dust from a bronze plaque near the coffin's base. Etched into it. Resurrectio Potestas, initiate upon papal silence. Phase Umbra authorized by CPF. Resurrection protocol, she muttered. That's what they're calling it. Michael's face twisted. Resurrection of what? A pope? A bloodline? An entire Vatican mythos? Lucia reached into a carved compartment beside the coffin and pulled out a stack of old parchment scrolls, tied with crimson ribbon. These documents, they describe a plan. It started decades ago. A shadow papacy, created in case of collapse. Michael read over her shoulder. The Latin was dense, theological, and terrifying. The scrolls detailed a fail-safe program. If the Church's leadership was ever deemed compromised beyond repair, a hidden order, under control of the CPF, could nullify the current Pope's reign and install a clean replacement. But not by vote. Not by conclave. By illusion. Back in his suite, Elon analyzed the voice message through his AI, Vox Day. The waveform contained an embedded pattern, every third frequency pulse was offset by 1 decibel. A hidden Morse code. THYTOKMWSON. Elon stared at the translation. Slowly, the pieces clicked. The Pope had a son. A hidden heir. Possibly the same child listed on the Petrus Romanus birth certificate. If this was true, it wasn't just a spiritual crisis. It was a dynastic one. The Vatican, rooted in celibacy and denial of blood ties, was harboring a hereditary secret. Lucia and Michael climbed back to the chapel above. Their hands were shaking. Michael finally spoke. The resurrection protocol isn't just about replacing the Pope. It's about replacing the idea of the Pope, Lucia finished. Whoever controls the successor, controls the Church's future. Michael nodded. We have to get that scroll out. Lucia pulled a burner phone from her coat. I'm not the only one working against them. There's someone watching from the Curia. They call themselves the Fishermen. He can get us to the Pope. Meanwhile, across town, the Italian Prime Minister was awakened at 3:17 a.m. by a private call. Elon Musk is in Rome, the voice said. And he's accessed Vatican servers. Again. What's he after? The Prime Minister asked groggily. A truth that's never meant to be proven, the voice answered. And if he exposes it, the entire Western world could fracture. 10:43 a.m. Vatican time. Elon entered the courtyard of the Pontifical Gregorian University, posing as a visiting philanthropist. He was met by a young Jesuit student who handed him a folded napkin. Written inside. The fisherman will meet you at 5 p.m., beneath the Tiber. Look for the woman with the scar. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. The Vatican was bleeding secrets. That evening, in a hidden tunnel beneath the Tiber River, where old aqueducts met the forgotten ruins of Nero's palace, Elon followed the glow of a single lantern. A woman stood alone. Tall, in a gray hooded cloak. A scar ran from her temple down to her cheek. Her accent was unmistakably Italian, but her eyes held centuries. You're him, she said. You're the fisherman, he asked. No, she replied. But I speak for him. She handed him a small velvet pouch. Inside, a fragment of the Pope's ring, the same one from the email that started all of this. But this piece had something new, an engraved coordinate. Somewhere in the Alban Hills, southeast of Rome. The real Pope, she said. They're keeping him there. Under surveillance. Underground. How do you know? Elon asked. Because, she said, I was there the night they took him. I was one of the nurses. Michael and Lucia rendezvoused with Elon at a neutral location outside Vatican City, a Benedictine abbey now abandoned, overtaken by moss and ivy. There, they spread the scrolls across an altar and matched the coordinates from the ring fragment to a hidden retreat once used by the Jesuits during the Cold War. Lucia looked up. If this place still exists, it's off-grid. No surveillance. No official record. The perfect prison for a pope. Michael nodded. We need to go tonight. Elon stared at the maps, the timelines, the ancient plans of resurrection. We're not just exposing the truth, he said quietly. We're about to steal the Pope back. The wind howled over the Alban Hills, the last light of dusk clinging to the horizon like a dying ember. The narrow road twisted through ancient olive groves and Roman ruins, leading to a stone villa barely visible through the trees. Villa Sancta Noctis. Once a spiritual retreat for Jesuit scholars, now a forgotten footnote in Vatican archives. But tonight, it was ground zero. Inside a black, unmarked SUV, Elon Musk, Father Michael Caruso, and Lucia Valenti sat in silence, staring at the approaching gate. The vehicle crawled to a stop behind a thicket of pine trees. This is it, Lucia whispered. This is where they're hiding him. Michael checked the pocket of his coat, the scrolls, the silver key, and a vial of chrism oil. Sacred. Symbolic. And maybe, tonight, necessary. Elon looked at Lucia. How do we get in? You don't, she said. Not through the front. She motioned to a crumbling trail behind the villa, once used by kitchen staff to bring up supplies. Back door. Through the cellar. The descent into the underground structure was tight, walls lined with mildew-covered stone, old iron hooks, and faded Latin warnings like non plus ultra. No further. Lucia pushed a heavy hatch open. Behind it, a small, sterile room. A single cot. And 4 drip. Soft breathing. And on that cot, Pope Leo XIV. Michael froze. It was him. Gaunt. Pale. But alive. The Holy Father. Elon stepped forward, scanning the room for cameras. No surveillance feed leaves this room. Totally analog. Lucia checked the Pope's pulse. He's sedated, but stable. Michael knelt beside him, grasping the Pope's frail hand. Your Holiness, he whispered. We're here. The Pope's eyes fluttered, not fully conscious, but aware. His lips parted slightly. A whisper escaped. Find him. Michael leaned in. Find who? The Pope's voice was barely a breath. My son. Flashback, 22 years ago. A young cardinal, not yet Pope, walks the cobbled streets of Assisi under a moonlit sky. At his side, a woman, sharp-eyed, fiercely intelligent, a theology scholar from Florence. Their affair is brief. But what it produces, is not. A boy. Born in secret. Raised by the Church under a false identity. Hidden from the public, but protected, educated, watched over. His name? Matteo Leone. Back in the present, Elon's AI pulls up records cross-referencing orphan registries with Vatican education funding patterns. One name rises to the top, listed under a Vatican scholarship since age 6, never adopted, but always placed in top-tier Catholic institutions. Now, at 21, he's a theology student, in Avignon, France. Michael stared at the screen. That's him. Lucia blinked. The heir. Meanwhile, in the Vatican, Cardinal Vitelli, head of the CPF, stood in a darkened chamber filled with red-robed advisors. On the center table, a map of Rome, photos of Elon, Michael, and Lucia, and a single line written in red ink. Operation Mirror concludes in 48 hours. Vitelli spoke coldly. The body in the crypt will be replaced. The smoke will rise again. And a new pope will be named. One of ours. Someone asked, what if the real one surfaces? Vitelli smiled. Then he'll die a martyr. Silently. Outside the villa, as the team prepared to extract the pope, a Vatican drone buzzed overhead. Elon noticed it first. We're made. Lucia shouted, back entrance, now. Gunfire cracked from the tree line. 2 dark-cloaked figures rushed the compound. Michael threw the chrism oil vial to Lucia and lifted the Pope into a blanket stretcher. Elon covered the door with a modified sonic blaster, non-lethal, but disorienting. They ran. By sunrise, they were back in Rome. Hidden in a safe house owned by an ex-ambassador, the Pope was hooked up to fluids. Stable. Lucid, barely. He looked at Michael with pleading eyes. Find Matteo. Before they do. That night, Elon posted a single tweet. Heir to the Church. Hidden for 2 decades. About to reclaim what was never supposed to be his. You ready? At Elon Musk. Within an hour, hashtags trend globally. Hashtag the last pope. Hashtag Vatican heir. Hashtag Petrus Romanus. Hashtag Churchgate. Panic brews. Headlines erupt. But one outlet gets ahead of the chaos. Breaking, Pope Leo XIV confirmed alive. Vatican in crisis. Source, Musk. The ancient walled city, once the seat of papal power during the 14th century, now found itself on the edge of another Vatican crisis. Matteo Leone, 21, didn't know he was being watched. He lived a quiet life. Theology student. Volunteer at the old Franciscan mission. Kept mostly to himself. Brilliant mind, according to his professors. Soft-spoken. passionate about reform. But today, none of that mattered. Because his DNA was about to make him the most dangerous man in Christendom. Back in Rome, Elon Musk streamed live from a secured channel. He didn't reveal everything, just enough. He released a voice memo of Pope Leo XIV whispering about a hidden son. A blurred scan of the birth certificate. A still frame of the Pope alive, dated days after his death. And a geopin dropped near Avignon. The final tweet read: "The heir exists. And he doesn't know it yet." At Elon Musk. The internet imploded. Inside the Vatican, Cardinal Vitelli's face turned pale. He's exposing everything. One of his advisors hissed, "If the boy reaches Rome, we lose the papacy." Vitelli clenched his jaw. Then he won't reach Rome. He tapped into a private line. "Activate Protocol Benedictus." And dispatch the black cassocks. Matteo was walking through a library courtyard when the first drone passed overhead. He looked up, confused. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. A video message. Lucia appeared, eyes sharp, voice calm. "Matteo, if you're seeing this, we need you to listen carefully. Your life is in danger. Not because of what you've done, but because of who you are." Matteo blinked. "You're the son of Pope Leo XIV. The Vatican's been lying to you. They've been hiding you. And now they're coming." Static. End message. He froze. That's when the first shot hit the wall behind him. In Rome, Michael, Elon, and Lucia watched the live feed. Matteo was on the run. "Do we extract him?" Michael asked. Lucia nodded. "There's a monastery 2 miles outside Avignon. Hidden tunnels. If he makes it there, we can pull him out." Elon was already messaging someone. "Divert the jet. We're going to France." As Matteo sprinted through alleyways and narrow passages, 2 men in black cassock uniforms, agents of the CPF, pursued him. Silent. Lethal. Trained for only one purpose. Eradicate the bloodline. He ducked into a florist's shop, shattering through the back door. One bullet grazed his arm. Bleeding. Panicked. Confused. A local priest, Father Jean-Claude, recognized him. Pulled him into a supply room. "Get down." Matteo gasped, "They're trying to kill me." Father Jean-Claude nodded. "I know. And I know why." He handed Matteo an envelope marked in red wax, Lux Veritatis. Light of Truth. Matteo tore it open. Inside, a letter. Handwritten. From his father. Dated 5 years earlier. "My dearest son. I write this knowing I may never see you again. You are my blood and my legacy, born into a world not ready for the truth. The church must evolve. And you are the key. Not because of a title. But because you were never meant to carry their chains." Matteo dropped the letter. The truth hit like thunder. Everything changed. The extraction team arrived 43 minutes later, Elon's private security, ex-MI6 and Swiss Guard defectors working with Lucia's network. They got Matteo out. By nightfall, he was on a jet to Rome. On board, Elon sat across from him. "You okay?" Matteo stared out the window, eyes hollow. "No. You believe it?" Matteo nodded slowly. "I do now." Elon leaned forward. "This isn't just about blood. This is about choice. You don't have to be anything they say you are." Matteo looked up. "But if I am, what does that make me?" Michael, watching quietly, finally spoke. "It makes you the first to be born into faith, but free from its lies." In Vatican City, protests were erupting outside St. Peter's Square. Crowds held signs. "Where is the Pope? Show US the Sun. Truth over tradition. CNN, BBC, and Reuters had picked up the story. The church issued a vague statement calling the allegations harmful speculation. But the damage was done. The world was watching. Inside a secret chamber in the Apostolic Palace, the CPF finalized their plan. If we can't stop the heir, Vitelli growled, we crown someone else first. We hijack the conclave. We fabricate the smoke. And we name our own pope. A cardinal asked, what will we call him? Vitelli smiled darkly. Peter II. The air in the Sistine Chapel was thick, as if the weight of centuries was pressing down on the stone walls. Cardinal Vitelli, now alone in the chamber, stood in front of the altar, hands clasped in prayer. But his thoughts were anything but holy. The conclave was coming. The smoke would rise within 48 hours, and a new pope would be declared to the world. The final phase of Operation Mirror was in motion, and this time, nothing could stand in their way. But there was one thing Vitelli had overlooked. The son. Matteo. Back in Rome, the tension was palpable. Matteo Leone had arrived from Avignon, but his presence in the city was a secret. The hidden son of Pope Leo XIV had never been publicly acknowledged, and now, the truth about his existence had shaken the very foundation of the Catholic Church. Elon Musk, now fully invested in the high-stakes battle for the papacy, was in constant contact with Father Michael and Lucia. Together, they were formulating a plan. We need to get Matteo into the Vatican, into the inner sanctum, before they can pull the final move, Elon said, his voice calm but urgent. If we don't, the Church will crown another puppet pope, and the truth will be buried for good. Father Michael, his face tight with worry, nodded. But how do we get past Vitelli's men? The CPF won't let anyone near the conclave. Lucia, who had been quiet up until this point, spoke up. I have an idea. There's a secret passage beneath St. Peter's Basilica, an ancient route used by the popes to escape during times of danger. It's been sealed for centuries, but I know where to find the key. Elon turned to her. Get it. We're running out of time. Matteo, meanwhile, had been staying at a safe house on the outskirts of the city, under the watchful eye of Lucia's network. The weight of the truth had hit him harder than he could have imagined. He was the Pope's son, the heir to a dynasty built on faith, secrecy, and power. But what did that mean for him now? A throne? A crown? A church that had abandoned him? He had so many questions, but there was one that haunted him above all others. What would the world say when they found out the true bloodline of St. Peter? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Lucia. It's time, she said, her voice steady but urgent. We're getting you in. Matteo stood up, his heart racing. In where? To the Vatican. The conclave is about to begin. We're getting you in before Vitelli can lock down the election. Inside the Sistine Chapel, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Cardinals from around the world gathered in silence, awaiting the white smoke that would signal the selection of the next pope. There was an air of uncertainty, though. No one knew who would emerge as the new leader of the Catholic Church. There were rumors, but nothing solid. At the far end of the chapel, Cardinal Vitelli stood with a group of his most loyal followers. He was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes, orchestrating the conclave to ensure his chosen candidate would be crowned as the next pope. But Vitelli's plan was not without its risks. The presence of Matteo Leone, the true heir, threatened everything he had worked for. If Matteo made it to the conclave, there was no way Vitelli could control the outcome. As Vitelli looked over the assembled cardinals, his eyes narrowed. He needed to act fast. The game was far from over. Meanwhile, Elon, Michael, and Lucia moved swiftly through the streets of Rome, guided by the ancient map Lucia had obtained. The key to the secret passage beneath St. Peter's Basilica was in their hands, and they had only a small window of time before the conclave began in earnest. Lucia led the group down a narrow alley, where an old wooden door was concealed behind ivy and moss. With a single, practiced motion, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The passage was dark, damp, and eerily quiet. The faint smell of old stone and earth filled the air. They moved quickly, knowing the stakes were higher than ever. "We're almost there," Lucia whispered. Back at the conclave, the cardinals had begun their voting. Tensions ran high as they cast their ballots for the next pope. Vitelli watched the proceedings carefully, his mind racing. He had manipulated the votes for years, ensuring that only his allies remained in the running. But what if something went wrong? What if the true heir appeared? He couldn't afford to take that risk. As Lucia led them deeper into the underground passage, they reached the final chamber, a hidden vault beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Inside, the walls were lined with relics, ancient texts, and centuries-old symbols. "This is it," Lucia said, unlocking the final door. Beyond it was a narrow staircase that led directly to the heart of the Vatican, the very chamber where the conclave would soon name the new pope. The conclave was nearing its conclusion. Vitelli was growing more desperate. Matteo had to be stopped. But as the doors to the Sistine Chapel began to close, a sudden sound echoed through the air. White smoke. The Pope had been chosen. But the smoke wasn't the only thing rising. The Sistine Chapel was filled with a heavy silence, but inside, chaos was beginning to brew. The white smoke had risen, signaling the selection of a new pope, but the cardinals who had gathered in prayer and hope were unaware that this papacy would not be what they had expected. There was no single, unified figure to celebrate, instead, it was a standoff. Cardinal Vitelli, standing at the front of the chapel, couldn't mask his smirk. His candidate had been chosen, Cardinal Peter II, a man loyal to his cause, who would, no doubt, serve Vitelli's agenda and maintain the status quo. Vitelli watched as the cardinals began to murmur in quiet excitement, already organizing the new leader's induction. But his victory was short-lived. Elsewhere in the Vatican, a shadow was moving through the underground chambers. It was Matteo. His heart was pounding as he navigated the ancient, secret corridors beneath the basilica. The centuries-old structure groaned with each step he took, as if the stone itself recognized his presence. This was no longer just a place of history, it was his birthright, his inheritance. He could feel the weight of the moment, the centuries of papal power closing in on him. He was born for this, or so it seemed. But could he really take the mantle? Could he lead? Was he ready to step into his father's shoes, or would he be swallowed whole by the very institution he was destined to change? Beside him, Lucia kept watch. Her eyes never stopped moving, scanning the dark corners of the passage, listening for any sign of pursuit. "We're almost there," she said quietly. Upstairs in the Sistine Chapel, the moment had arrived. The white smoke was thick, rising from the chimney. News outlets around the world were already broadcasting live footage, capturing the excitement of the Vatican's oldest ritual. But the reporters and pundits hadn't noticed something crucial. They hadn't noticed that the true heir was on his way. At the altar, Cardinal Vitelli moved toward the newly chosen pope, his voice low as he whispered in Cardinal Peter II's ear. "Congratulations. You're going to make a fine pope, but remember, I'm the one who holds the keys." But before Peter could respond, a hush fell over the crowd. The heavy doors of the Sistine Chapel creaked open. Matteo stepped into the chapel, flanked by Lucia and Michael, his presence as commanding as it was unexpected. Gasps rippled through the congregation. The cardinals froze. Even Vitelli's self-assured demeanor faltered for a fraction of a second. The congregation parted as Matteo moved to the center of the room, the weight of his heritage settling onto his shoulders. He was no longer just a boy or an unknown heir. He was the son of St. Peter, the true pope. His voice, when it came, was quiet but carried through the sacred hall. "I am Matteo Leone, son of Pope Leo XIV, born of the Holy See." A murmur of disbelief swept through the room, followed by confusion. Cardinal Peter II, still standing near the altar, stared at Matteo, his face a mask of confusion and fear. Vitelli stepped forward, his face pale but his composure mostly intact. He raised a hand, his voice sharp. "This is blasphemy. You have no right to be here." Matteo's gaze was unwavering. "I have every right. I am the rightful heir." The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. Elon Musk, watching from a remote location, tapped into the Vatican's private network. He had expected this moment. It was inevitable. He had taken every precaution to ensure Matteo's arrival was calculated, precise. No one could stop the heir from stepping into the light. His tweet was simple, but it carried the weight of a revelation. The truth is out. The son of St. Peter returns to claim his place. The church will never be the same again. At Elon Musk. Some clung to their loyalty to Vitelli, their trust in the current pope, the man they had just chosen. Others looked at Matteo, his bloodline undeniable, and felt the stirrings of doubt. A few murmured among themselves, "He's the son, it's his birthright." But Vitelli would not relent. He raised his voice again, commanding, "Matteo Leone is no pope. He is an illegitimate child, a threat to the sacred office of St. Peter." The word stung, but Matteo didn't flinch. He turned to face the gathered cardinals, his voice calm yet filled with authority. "It is the church that has deceived you, not me. I am not here to claim power for myself. I am here to restore the true church, the one my father dreamed of. The church that serves God, not power." In the far corner of the chapel, Father Michael Caruso stepped forward, his eyes burning with intensity. "You all know the truth. The prophecies, the records, they cannot be ignored. Matteo Leone is the true heir." His words rang through the chapel like a bell, resonating with the very essence of the Vatican itself. The cardinals murmured again, torn between tradition and truth. In a final, desperate attempt to maintain control, Vitelli signaled his supporters. The black-suited figures hidden among the cardinals moved toward Matteo, weapons drawn. But Lucia and Michael were ready. They had anticipated this. In the chaos that followed, the guards were quickly subdued, taken down without a single shot fired. "Enough," Matteo said, his voice like thunder. "I did not come here to fight. I came to bring truth. Let the conclave decide. But know this, I am the rightful pope." As the cardinals sat in stunned silence, the pope's chair, the chair of St. Peter, slowly tilted forward, as if beckoning Matteo to sit. The symbol of papal authority, an ancient relic passed down through centuries, was now a silent witness to history. Matteo moved forward, the weight of the world on his shoulders. Without a word, he sat in the chair of St. Peter. The room fell into a heavy silence, the only sound being the soft echo of his breath. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The world outside the Vatican was in chaos. News outlets from every corner of the globe had gone into overdrive, broadcasting live footage of the scene inside the Sistine Chapel. Matteo Leone, the son of Pope Leo XIV, had claimed his birthright, and the Vatican was torn between accepting him or rejecting him entirely. The cardinals who had once been united in their loyalty to Cardinal Vitelli and his chosen candidate, Cardinal Peter II, now found themselves in a precarious position. Inside the Sistine Chapel, the room was divided. On one side stood the loyalists of Cardinal Vitelli, their expressions hard with disbelief and defiance. On the other side were the voices of doubt, those who were beginning to question the Church's leadership, the centuries-old traditions that had shaped the Vatican for so long. And then there was Matteo, seated in the chair of St. Peter, a figure of undeniable authority, but one that was equally a symbol of division. Father Michael Caruso had made his way to Matteo's side, his voice filled with urgency. "Matteo, you have to know what this means. They won't let this go easily. Vitelli's influence runs deep." Matteo didn't take his eyes off the room full of cardinals. His hand rested lightly on the papal chair's arm, as if feeling the weight of the centuries that had passed since the last true pope had sat in this seat. The air in the room seemed to hum with power and history. But that same power now felt fragile, like a thread that could snap at any moment. "I'm not afraid of Vitelli," Matteo said, his voice steady, though his heart raced. "But I'm not here for power. I'm here for the truth. I'm here to restore what the Church was meant to be." Outside the Vatican, the protests had begun. People gathered in the streets of Rome, holding signs that read, "Restore the faith, the true Pope returns," and "End the corruption." The division had spilled over into the public. Some cheered for Matteo, the true heir of the papacy, while others decried him as a usurper, a man who threatened the stability of the Church. Elon Musk had been closely following the events, his eyes glued to the live footage as he sat in his office. The world was watching, and the stakes were higher than ever. Meanwhile, in the corridors of the Vatican, Cardinal Vitelli paced angrily. He couldn't believe what had just unfolded. His plan, years in the making, was falling apart before his eyes. The papal throne was supposed to be his tool for power, a way for him to control the destiny of the Catholic Church. But now, Matteo had thrown everything into turmoil. Vitelli's loyalists, many of whom were still reeling from the shock, gathered around him. "This cannot be allowed to stand, Cardinal," one of them said, his voice low and anxious. "The legitimacy of the papacy is at stake." Vitelli stopped pacing and turned to face his supporters. "We will not let this child of an illegitimate pope take what is rightfully ours. Matteo may have blood, but I have influence, and I will use it." He stormed toward a desk and pulled out a sealed envelope. The contents were crucial, the key to undermining Matteo's claim to the throne. "We will discredit him. We'll bring the truth about his birth to light. We'll expose his very existence as a threat to the integrity of the Church." Back inside the Sistine Chapel, the cardinals were still in heated discussion. The divide between those who supported Matteo and those who supported Vitelli was growing wider by the second. A few voices rose in support of Matteo, though their numbers were still small. Cardinal Peter too, still reeling from the shock of the situation, stood at the altar, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. He had never expected this. He had never expected that Matteo would walk into the conclave like a force of nature and claim the papacy. His life, his position, was now in jeopardy. "What happens now?" Peter whispered to the cardinal standing beside him. "We fight for what we have," the man replied, his tone cold. "We fight for the real pope, the one who is loyal to the Vatican, not to some boy who believes he's the heir." Lucia, still by Matteo's side, felt the tension in the room grow tighter. She had warned him, but seeing it unfold before her eyes made it all the more real. The Church was fracturing. The old ways were being challenged, and that scared the very core of the Vatican. She leaned in close to Matteo. "They won't give up. Vitelli will use every means at his disposal to take you down. He's powerful, and his supporters will fight tooth and nail to protect their vision of the Church." "I know," Matteo replied, his voice soft but resolute. "But we won't back down. This is the moment the Church has been waiting for." Suddenly, a voice echoed through the chapel, carrying with it an unsettling force. It was Cardinal Vitelli. "If you want to destroy the Church, then go ahead," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "But don't fool yourselves into thinking this will be easy. You cannot just waltz in here and claim what is mine." Matteo stood, his eyes fixed on Vitelli. "The papacy doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people. To the Church. To God." Elon Musk, from a faraway corner of the world, watched with a cold expression as the battle for the Vatican escalated. He had placed his bets on Matteo, but this was far more dangerous than he had anticipated. It was no longer about the papacy, it was about the soul of the Church itself. He knew that Vitelli would stop at nothing to take Matteo down, but he also knew something else: Matteo had the support of the people, and that could change everything. It was now a battlefield. The Church's future was in the hands of those who were brave enough to stand against the centuries-old tradition of control and corruption. The Vatican had transformed overnight. What was once a sanctuary of holiness and serenity had now become a fortress under siege. The quiet halls of the Vatican were filled with whispers of conflict, tension in the air thick enough to choke. Matteo Leone, the true heir to the papacy, was under threat. The cardinals who had once pledged their loyalty to the old order now found themselves caught in the middle of a power struggle that could shatter centuries of tradition. The clock was ticking. Cardinal Vitelli had marshaled his forces. He had the backing of a powerful faction of the cardinals, many of whom believed that only the status quo could preserve the integrity of the Church. Matteo, on the other hand, had the support of the people. The streets of Rome were flooded with thousands of voices demanding the truth: the true Pope had returned. But in the halls of power, only one thing mattered now: who would control the Vatican? Inside the Vatican, a council of war was being held. Cardinal Vitelli stood at the head of a table, his cold gaze sweeping over the men who had gathered around him. His supporters were fierce and unwavering, many of them high-ranking cardinals with deep ties to the inner workings of the Church. But Vitelli knew that in this battle, influence and loyalty wouldn't be enough. "We must act swiftly," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Matteo may have the people, but we control the Vatican. We know its secrets, its weaknesses. And we will use them." Meanwhile, outside St. Peter's Basilica, the crowds had grown larger. The streets of Rome were a sea of protesters and supporters, each side growing louder, more passionate. News outlets from around the world had set up camp, broadcasting live from the heart of the crisis. The Vatican was no longer a mere symbol of faith, it was the center of a global conflict. The crowds outside were split, half chanting Matteo's name, calling for the rightful pope to take his place. The other half, led by Vitelli's supporters, shouted for the protection of the old ways. The Vatican was a symbol of power, and both sides wanted control of that power. Inside the halls of St. Peter's Basilica, Matteo sat in a papal chair, his hands clasped together as he looked out at the chaos unfolding beyond the walls. He had never wanted this: the violence, the destruction, the war. But he understood that his birthright came with responsibility. If the Church was to survive, it needed to change, to evolve. Lucia stood by his side, her expression stern. "This won't end without bloodshed, Matteo. Vitelli won't back down. He's already rallied his forces. They'll come for us. You need to be prepared." Matteo nodded. He had always known this would come to a head. But the reality of war, of losing everything he had once believed in, was harder to swallow than he had imagined. "I didn't ask for this," he said, his voice quiet. "I didn't want to tear the Church apart. But it's bigger than me now. It's bigger than Vitelli. It's about the future of the faith, the soul of the Church." Lucia stepped forward. "And you'll protect it, no matter the cost." Across the Vatican, Vitelli's loyalists were mobilizing. They had access to everything, from secret passages to hidden vaults. The ancient Vatican infrastructure was theirs to command. Their strategy was simple: seize control of the basilica, and force Matteo to submit. A group of armed guards moved through the darkened hallways of the Vatican, their footsteps echoing through the ancient corridors. They were heading straight for St. Peter's Basilica, the heart of the Vatican, where Matteo held court. Back outside, a storm was brewing. The Vatican security force had barricaded the entrances to St. Peter's Basilica, preparing for the inevitable. Soldiers lined the walls, their weapons at the ready. The faithful who had gathered to support Matteo were chanting his name, waving banners. The atmosphere was charged, electric with anticipation. At the same time, in the distance, the unmistakable rumble of military vehicles could be heard. Vitelli's supporters were bringing reinforcements. The Vatican was about to be stormed. Inside St. Peter's Basilica, Matteo stood up. He had made his decision. There would be no retreat. The papacy was his birthright, and he would not let anyone, not even Cardinal Vitelli, take that from him. We have to fight, Matteo said firmly. I will not let this place fall into the wrong hands. The doors of St. Peter's Basilica were suddenly breached. Vitelli's men stormed the entrance, their footsteps heavy as they marched toward the heart of the basilica. The battle for the future of the church had begun. Inside the basilica, Matteo and his loyal supporters prepared to face the invaders. They knew this would be no ordinary confrontation, it was a battle for the very soul of the Vatican. In the chaos, the air was thick with tension. As Vitelli's forces poured into the basilica, the faithful who had gathered in support of Matteo fought back, using whatever they could find to defend their pope. Lucia moved swiftly, her eyes scanning the room for any threats. Beside her, Father Michael Caruso was ready, his expression unwavering as he prepared to stand beside Matteo to the end. This is our moment, Michael said, his voice filled with determination. We protect the Pope. We protect the faith. Outside, the crowds grew more desperate. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets of Rome, a grim reminder of the violence that had consumed the Vatican. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, and the streets were filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Back inside, the battle raged on. Vitelli's forces were relentless, but Matteo's supporters were just as determined. The papal chair, once a symbol of peace and divine authority, had now become a battleground. The clash of swords, the crackle of gunfire, and the shouts of both sides filled the air. In the midst of the chaos, Matteo stood tall, his eyes fixed on the altar. He would not let the Vatican fall into ruin. He would not let it become another casualty of corruption. Matteo, with the help of his loyal supporters, made his way to the altar, where Vitelli's forces had gathered. They faced each other, the Pope and the would-be usurper. I will not bow to you, Matteo said, his voice filled with defiance. The Church belongs to the people, to God, not to you. Vitelli sneered. You are a child. You do not understand the power you are playing with. But as the two men locked eyes, the future of the Vatican seemed to hang in the balance. The fight had just begun, and only one side would emerge victorious. The battle was far from over. Inside the sacred walls of the Vatican's most hallowed ground, the deafening sounds of gunfire and clashing swords filled the air. The papal seat was no longer a symbol of peace, it had become a throne of fire and blood. Matteo stood firm in the heart of the basilica, flanked by his loyal supporters, including Lucia and Father Michael Caruso. The walls of the basilica, adorned with centuries of religious art and history, now felt like a prison, a battleground where the soul of the Church would be fought for, one life at a time. Vitelli's forces had breached the sanctum, their footsteps echoing in the marble corridors, but they hadn't anticipated the fierce resistance of those who stood with Matteo. The basilica had become a war zone, each inch gained and lost a testament to the ferocity of the conflict. And with every passing moment, the stakes grew higher. Outside, the air was thick with anticipation. The world was watching as the siege unfolded live across the globe. News stations flashed images of the chaos, the smoke rising from the Vatican, the clashes between Matteo's supporters and Vitelli's loyalists. The streets of Rome were filled with whispers, and people anxiously waited to see how the Vatican's power struggle would unfold. In the midst of it all, Elon Musk sat in his private office, watching the scene unfold on his screen. His involvement in this battle, the coup of a papacy, had always been calculated, and though he stood on the sidelines, he knew the world's reaction to the outcome would reshape everything. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, and his thoughts ran deep. Matteo was the underdog, but the people, the very fabric of faith itself, seemed to rally around him. But would it be enough? Back inside the basilica, the air felt oppressive. The battle had moved from the main halls to the inner sanctum, where Matteo and his allies prepared for the final showdown. Every room they passed, every step they took, seemed to echo with the history of the Catholic Church. But that history was now stained with blood. Lucia pulled Matteo aside, her face tense. They're closing in on us. We can't hold out forever. You need to make a decision. Matteo's jaw tightened as he glanced around, his mind racing. I never wanted this. I never wanted war. But I won't let them destroy what my father tried to build. Father Michael joined them, his expression grave. Matteo, we need to face the truth. Vitelli's men are many, but there's something worse than numbers, betrayal. Matteo's gaze hardened. What are you saying, Father? Father Michael looked over his shoulder before leaning in closer. There's a traitor among us. Someone here, in this room, is working for Vitelli. And they're feeding him information. Meanwhile, across the battlefield, Cardinal Vitelli paced back and forth with a furious energy. His forces were pushing forward, but something was amiss. The resistance from Matteo's side was stronger than anticipated. As his commanders approached him with new reports, Vitelli scowled. This battle should have been over by now, Vitelli hissed. Why is it taking so long? One of his commanders, a tall, dark-haired man named Tommaso, leaned in. It seems there is a surprise resistance. Some of the factions that were supposed to be neutral are turning against us. They're not here to fight for us, Cardinal. Vitelli's eyes narrowed. Someone is playing us. Back in the heart of the basilica, Matteo's head was spinning. A traitor in their midst. The thought was unthinkable. But Father Michael's words couldn't be ignored. Who could it be? Matteo asked, his voice low. We've trusted every one of these men. They've sworn loyalty. Father Michael sighed, looking over at Lucia. It's someone close. Someone who has the access to undermine us without being seen. Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, and the group fell silent. Tommaso, the leader of Vitelli's forces, appeared at the entrance. His expression was cold, calculating. Matteo Leone, Tommaso said, his voice dripping with malice. The great usurper, the boy who would be pope. Matteo stood tall, his heart racing. This is where it ends, Tommaso. You can't win. The people are with me. Tommaso smirked. The people? You're a fool, Matteo. The people are nothing compared to the power of the Vatican. And I have the Vatican's greatest asset on my side. Suddenly, the doors of the basilica burst open, and the traitors stepped forward, their identity revealed, Father Michael Caruso. Matteo's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. The man he had trusted, the one who had been by his side through thick and thin, was the one who had betrayed him. Father Michael stood before them, a wry smile playing at the edges of his lips. You thought I was on your side, didn't you, Matteo? How quaint. Matteo's hand instinctively reached for his rosary, but his mind was racing. Why? Why betray me? Father Michael stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with cold detachment. Because the church is broken, Matteo. It's been broken for centuries. You don't have the vision. You're a child, trying to play a man's game. I've seen what Vitelli can offer, power, wealth, influence. It's the future of the church, Matteo. You're simply a blip in its history. Lucia's voice cracked as she shouted, You're a traitor to the very faith you claim to serve. Father Michael didn't flinch. Faith? No. I serve power. And I always have. The battlefield inside St. Peter's Basilica shifted. Matteo's supporters, betrayed from within, faltered. The sound of gunfire and the clash of steel seemed to grow louder as the tide of the battle shifted against them. Tommaso stepped forward, offering a hand to Father Michael. You've done well. We'll finish what you've started. Outside, the crowds were in turmoil. The news had reached them, Matteo had been betrayed. The chants for his name turned to cries of anguish, and the future of the papacy seemed more uncertain than ever. But in the deepest corners of the Vatican, a new force was stirring. The true power of the people, their loyalty to the truth, would soon make its mark on the battlefield. The echo of Father Michael's betrayal reverberated through the walls of the basilica, a sound far more profound than the clash of swords or the gunfire that filled the air. Matteo stood frozen, his gaze locked on the traitor who had once stood beside him, a man he had trusted with his life. Father Michael's lips curled into a cruel smile, his eyes cold and calculating. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you, Matteo?" he taunted, stepping forward. "You, the rightful pope, trying to bring change to an institution that has thrived on tradition for centuries. You were never meant to succeed." Matteo's heart was heavy, but his resolve was not broken. He refused to let Father Michael's treachery defeat him. The church had always been a place of unwavering faith, and as much as betrayal had sunk its teeth into his heart, Matteo knew the truth: the people would stand with him. He could not let them down. Outside, the streets of Rome had become a battleground in their own right. The masses who had once rallied behind Matteo's cause were now divided, their hopes dashed by the sudden and devastating blow of betrayal. News outlets had broadcasted Father Michael's defection across the world, and the protests that had begun in support of the young pope quickly turned into a chaotic maelstrom of confusion and fear. Some of the faithful began to doubt. Had they been misled? Was the papacy now irreparably tainted? Vitelli's forces, now emboldened by the betrayal from within, began to tighten their grip, turning the Vatican into an impenetrable fortress. Back inside the basilica, the air was thick with tension. Matteo glanced around, his mind racing. The walls seemed to close in on him, the weight of his situation pressing harder with every passing second. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future of the faith. It was about the church. "Lucia," Matteo whispered, his voice low, almost a prayer. "We can't let this be the end." Lucia, who had been at his side throughout the entire ordeal, her face pale but her determination clear, nodded. "We still have one thing Vitelli doesn't." Matteo raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "The people," Lucia said firmly. "You've always said that the church belongs to them. Let's prove it." Father Michael laughed, his voice echoing through the grand chamber. "You really think the people care about you, Matteo? They follow the Pope because they want stability, not revolution. They'll choose Vitelli. They always do." But as Father Michael spoke, something stirred within Matteo. A thought, a realization that had been slowly growing in him. The people may have been swayed by tradition, but deep down, they were searching for something more. Something real. "Do you really believe the people would choose a man like you?" Matteo shot back, his voice growing louder, filled with renewed confidence. "You serve power. You don't serve them. And that's why you'll lose." Lucia stepped up beside him, her expression fierce. "We'll show them, Michael. We'll show them the truth." Outside the Vatican gates, a new force began to stir. Though the betrayal had devastated Matteo's followers, it had also ignited something deeper in their hearts. They had felt the burn of injustice, the betrayal of their trust. But even in the face of despair, they rallied. The calls for justice that had once been scattered, like whispers in the streets, began to grow louder. The masses, those who had seen the truth in Matteo's rise to power, now fought to keep his cause alive. What began as confusion turned into action. Citizens took to the streets, not just to protest, but to demand the truth, to demand a fair future for the church. Across the world, from New York to Manila, the cry of "Justice for Matteo" spread. Religious leaders, scholars, and activists began to speak out, calling for a revolution from within the church, one that would stand against the corruption that had festered for centuries. Back inside the Vatican, the tides were shifting. Vitelli's forces had been bolstered by Father Michael's betrayal, but as the faithful outside found their voice, the dynamics of the battle changed. The belief in Matteo's leadership had ignited a fire that could not be extinguished by treachery alone. Matteo turned to Lucia, his eyes filled with a new sense of purpose. "We can still win this. We need to bring the people inside." Lucia nodded, her mind already racing. "But Vitelli controls the outer gates. We'll never make it past them without a fight." Matteo looked at Father Michael, who stood silently, watching the tension unfold. "You were always a coward, Michael," Matteo said, his voice thick with contempt. "You'll never understand the power of faith. But you'll understand defeat." The cold smirk on Father Michael's face faltered for a moment, a crack in his composure. For the first time, doubt crossed his eyes. A single voice rose from the crowd outside the Vatican, a chant, soft at first, but growing steadily in volume. "Matteo! Matteo! Matteo!" It was the spark that would set the world ablaze. The faithful rallied in unison. The streets outside the Vatican became a sea of supporters, chanting for Matteo, not just as the rightful pope, but as the leader of a new movement, one that would restore the Church to its true calling, the service of the people. Inside, the sudden change was palpable. As the cries grew louder, the strength of the rebellion surged. Vitelli's forces, who had been so sure of their victory, began to waver. The sounds of gunfire and shouting intensified as the people outside demanded access to the inner sanctum of the Vatican. It was then that Tommaso, the commander of Vitelli's forces, approached Matteo. His voice was hesitant, almost unsure. "The people, they're not backing down. They're pushing against the gates." Vitelli's plan had been flawless, until now. The people had begun to fight back, not with weapons, but with unity. It was the same unity that had once brought Matteo to the forefront, and now, it was the same unity that would bring him victory. In the heart of the basilica, the final stand was about to begin. Vitelli's forces may have been powerful, but the power of the people could not be denied. The gates of St. Peter's Basilica shuddered, and as they began to open, the truth was clear, the tide was turning. Matteo had not only become the face of a revolution, but he was about to reclaim his destiny. The heavy, reverberating sound of the gates creaking open echoed throughout the vast halls of the Vatican. Matteo stood at the threshold of the inner sanctum, his heart pounding as the crowd outside grew louder, their chants shaking the very foundations of the holy ground. "Matteo! Matteo! Matteo!" The voices of the faithful outside rang out, growing in volume, echoing through the marble halls of the basilica. But the battle within the walls of the Vatican had not ceased. The conflict that had raged for so long, between those who followed Matteo's vision for a reformed church and those who supported the corruption of Vitelli, had reached a fever pitch. Matteo's supporters, though outnumbered, fought fiercely, but the odds had shifted dramatically with Father Michael's betrayal. The traitor had been a crucial figure among Matteo's inner circle, and his defection had sown distrust. Yet, even as Vitelli's forces appeared to close in on victory, the strength of the people outside, their voices rising in unison, was a reminder of why Matteo had risked everything. Outside the Vatican, the streets had transformed into a battleground. The faithful, ordinary men and women, devout followers, and even those who had been skeptical of Matteo's rise to power, had all come together in a final stand. The crowd surged toward the gates, and with each passing moment, their presence became a force that could no longer be ignored. People shouted, cried, and waved flags. The power of unity had become something tangible, almost divine in its force. The world had watched Matteo's rise, his journey, his fall, and now his rebirth, and they had made their decision. In the midst of the chaos, Elon Musk, ever the observer, was glued to his screens. He could feel the tide turning, the moment of truth arriving. From his vantage point, this wasn't just about the church, it was about power, about influence, about rewriting history. But in this moment, he understood, Matteo's success would mean that the old world order, the very foundation of power, was being challenged. It was no longer just a battle for the Vatican, it was a battle for the future of faith, for the future of humanity. Back inside the basilica, the air was thick with tension. The final confrontation was imminent. Matteo stood at the altar, flanked by his most loyal followers, the remnants of his once great alliance. Lucia, her face pale but resolute, stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the doors as if waiting for the inevitable. Tommaso and Vitelli's forces were closing in. The betrayal of Father Michael had thrown their plans into disarray, but Vitelli's thirst for power was unquenchable. He would stop at nothing to seize the Vatican and the papacy. His men were positioned throughout the basilica, their weapons trained on the few who still resisted. But Matteo, though surrounded by enemies, stood undaunted. The people outside had found their voice, and their support was his lifeline. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for the soul of the church. Lucia leaned in, her voice urgent. Matteo, we can't wait much longer. Vitelli's forces are too strong. If we're going to do this, we need to act now. Matteo turned to her, his face a mask of determination. We've come too far to turn back now. Vitelli's voice echoed through the basilica as he entered with a squadron of his men. He stood at the center of the great hall, his cold eyes scanning the room. Matteo, he said, his voice booming. You've been a thorn in my side for far too long. It ends today. Matteo's gaze met Vitelli's, his voice steady but filled with unyielding resolve. It ends, yes. But not the way you think. Vitelli smirked, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The church belongs to me now. You, a child, have no place in it. You may have fooled the people for a time, but they will see the truth eventually. But you're wrong, Vitelli, Matteo replied, stepping forward. The people are not fools. They know what you are. Vitelli's eyes flickered with anger, but he didn't flinch. Then let the battle speak for itself. The sound of battle erupted as Vitelli's men surged forward. A violent clash of steel and gunfire filled the air. The tension that had been building for so long had finally exploded into chaos. Each side fought with everything they had. Matteo's loyalists, though outnumbered, were fierce in their defense of the Vatican. Matteo fought with the strength of a man who had nothing left to lose. Every strike he made was a strike for the future of the church, for the future of the people who believed in him. His determination was unwavering. Lucia, by his side, fought valiantly, her movements swift and precise. She had become a symbol of hope, a symbol of the strength that was rising from the ashes of the betrayal. And then, as the battle raged, the people outside the gates surged forward. The barricades that had been set up to keep them back crumbled beneath the weight of their collective will. Their chants rang louder, their voices more powerful than ever. Matteo! 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 It was the cry of the people, the cry of revolution. Inside the basilica, the tide began to turn. Vitelli's forces, though superior in numbers, were now facing something they had not expected, the sheer power of belief. The people outside were not just fighting for Matteo, they were fighting for their faith, their dignity, their right to choose a future free of corruption. Matteo, feeling the surge of hope, turned to face his enemy once more. It's over, Vitelli, he said, his voice steady, filled with conviction. You may have had the power, but you've lost the people. Vitelli's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening around his sword. You think they'll follow you? You think you've won? Matteo stepped forward, his voice booming. They follow truth, not power. And they will never follow you again. In the final moments of the battle, Matteo's forces overwhelmed Vitelli's men. The strength of the people, their unity, was undeniable. The gates of St. Peter's Basilica had been breached, and the faithful poured inside, their voices rising in unison with Matteo's. Vitelli, surrounded and outnumbered, tried to retreat. But it was too late. Matteo had won. The battle for the Vatican, the battle for the soul of the Church, was over. As the dust settled and the last of Vitelli's forces were rounded up, Matteo stood at the altar, the weight of victory and loss heavy on his shoulders. The battle had been won, but the journey was far from over. The true test now lay ahead: how to rebuild, how to restore the Church to its rightful place, and how to guide its people into a future founded on truth and love. The air in the basilica felt different now, lighter, yet heavy with the responsibility of what lay ahead. The war was over, but the true work was only beginning. The once imposing walls of the Vatican, scarred by battle, now stood as silent witnesses to the change that had taken place. Matteo stood at the altar, alone for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The aftermath of the battle had left him physically and emotionally drained, but a fire still burned within him. He had faced betrayal, loss, and despair, but he had emerged victorious. The forces of corruption had been driven out, and the people had spoken. Outside, the streets of Rome were alive with the sound of celebration, but there was no time to rest. The victory was his, yes, but the true test lay in how he would lead the church forward. The voices of the faithful outside had helped him reclaim the Vatican, but now they would demand more. They would demand real change. The aftermath of the battle was felt across the globe. News of Vitelli's defeat spread quickly, and the world watched as the young pope, once a symbol of uncertainty and revolution, stood tall, his faith and conviction unshaken. The church had been torn apart, but it had also been reborn. Matteo's followers, emboldened by his triumph, began to rally behind him with renewed fervor. But they were not the only ones watching. Elon Musk, from his corner of the world, continued to observe closely. The Vatican's upheaval was more than just a political struggle, it was a shift in the world order, one that held implications far beyond religion. The potential for reform within such an ancient institution had sparked Musk's curiosity. Could the church truly adapt to the modern age? Could it evolve into something that resonated with a new generation? These questions lingered in his mind, pushing him to consider his next move. As the world turned its eyes toward Rome, Matteo knew he could not afford to waste any time. The rebuilding of the church, both physically and spiritually, would require every ounce of strength and wisdom he had. Inside the Vatican, the halls were quiet. The chaos of the past days had given way to a solemn silence, one that weighed heavily on Matteo's shoulders. He had defeated Vitelli and restored the papacy, but now he had to prove that his vision could withstand the test of time. Lucia approached him, her footsteps soft against the marble floor. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with admiration. Matteo turned to her, a tired but determined look on his face. "We did it," he corrected her. "None of this would have been possible without you, without the people." Lucia smiled faintly. "But now comes the hardest part." Matteo nodded, his gaze drifting to the stained glass windows, where the light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the room. "The real battle isn't over. I've fought to reclaim the Vatican, but now I have to rebuild it, from the ground up." In the days that followed, the rebuilding process began in earnest. The physical damage to the Vatican, though extensive, was nothing compared to the fractures that had formed within the church itself. Trust had been broken, and faith had been shaken. Many of the faithful who had rallied behind Matteo now looked to him to provide answers, to guide them through the uncertain future that lay ahead. Matteo held meetings with his closest allies, strategizing how best to restore the integrity of the church. They discussed reforms, both spiritual and administrative, that would allow the Vatican to move forward without repeating the mistakes of the past. "We have to start with transparency," Matteo said during one such meeting, his voice resolute. "The church can no longer operate in the shadows. We need to be accountable to the people." Lucia, who had become his most trusted advisor, agreed. "We need to show them that the church is for everyone, not just the powerful." The world began to take notice of the changes taking place within the Vatican. Matteo's reforms were bold, unprecedented. The Vatican's finances, once a closely guarded secret, were now under scrutiny. There were talks of eliminating the secretive conclaves that had governed the selection of the Pope for centuries. Matteo had promised a more inclusive and transparent future, one that would bring the church closer to the people. But not everyone was pleased with the changes. Resistance from those loyal to the old guard was fierce. Cardinals and bishops who had once benefited from the established order saw their influence begin to wane, and they would not let go of their power without a fight. One evening, as Matteo walked through the Vatican gardens, deep in thought, he was joined by a familiar figure. It was Tommaso, the commander of Vitelli's forces, the man who had once been a part of the enemy's camp. Tommaso had surrendered in the wake of the battle and had been imprisoned, but something had changed within him. After months of reflection, he had come to Matteo with an offer to work with him in the rebuilding of the church. "I've seen what you've done, Matteo," Tommaso said, his voice steady but filled with respect. "I never believed in your cause, but I see now that you're not just trying to take power. You're trying to change something that has been broken for centuries." Matteo regarded him carefully. "You want to help me rebuild the church?" Tommaso nodded. "I've seen the error of my ways. I fought for power, but now I understand that it's about something greater. I want to be part of the change. If you'll have me." Matteo considered Tommaso's words. Trust would not come easily, not after everything that had happened. But the church, the people, needed everyone. It was a time for healing, for mending the wounds that had been inflicted over the years. "If you're truly committed to change," Matteo said slowly, "then I'll accept your help. But the road ahead won't be easy." Tommaso's gaze was unwavering. "I'm ready." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Reforms were implemented, and the Vatican's leadership began to change. A new council of advisors, chosen from a diverse range of backgrounds, was established to help guide the church into the future. Matteo worked tirelessly, meeting with religious leaders, scholars, and activists from around the world to chart a course that would be inclusive and forward-thinking. But the path to reform was not without its obstacles. The resistance from the old guard was relentless, and every step forward seemed to be met with a step back. But Matteo refused to give in. With Lucia by his side and the support of the people, he pushed forward, determined to create a church that truly served the faithful. One day, as Matteo stood at the window of his private office, overlooking the city of Rome, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. From a young man with big ideas to a pope who had defied all odds, he had faced betrayal, loss, and despair. But now, with the weight of the Vatican's future resting on his shoulders, he felt a sense of clarity. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: he was not alone. And together, they would rebuild. The weight of the Vatican seemed heavier with each passing day. The echoes of the past still clung to the stone walls of St. Peter's Basilica, the remnants of a church that had endured centuries of scandal, corruption, and betrayal. Matteo had thought that victory would bring relief, but instead, it only intensified the burden he carried. The rebuilding of the church was not just a matter of restoring broken infrastructure, it was a matter of restoring the very soul of the institution. And that was a far more difficult task than Matteo had ever anticipated. Matteo sat at his desk, the papers before him a blur of reform proposals, financial audits, and letters of support from all corners of the world. Despite the efforts to bring transparency to the Vatican's finances, the old guard within the church remained entrenched, unwilling to let go of the power they had long held. It was a slow, painstaking process to bring about real change, and Matteo found himself facing constant resistance, not just from external forces, but from within the walls of the Vatican itself. Lucia, ever by his side, walked into the room with a new set of papers in her hands. "I've gone over the latest reports. There are some troubling signs, Matteo," she said, setting the papers down in front of him. Matteo glanced at the documents, his face growing darker. "I've been expecting this. The old guard won't go down without a fight. They're organizing. A number of influential cardinals and bishops are rallying behind a counter-reformation. They believe your reforms are tearing apart the very fabric of the church." Matteo's hands clenched into fists. "I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I didn't expect it to be this relentless. They think they can stop me. They don't understand that I'm fighting for the church, for the people." Lucia paused, her expression thoughtful. "You've given them hope, Matteo. But you've also given them fear. They know they're losing control, and they'll do whatever it takes to regain it." As Matteo and Lucia continued to strategize, the streets of Rome remained a battleground of ideas. On one hand, there were those who supported Matteo's vision, who believed that the church could evolve into something more transparent, more in touch with the world around it. On the other hand, there were the diehards, those who clung to the old ways, refusing to accept the possibility that the church could be reformed. The resistance wasn't just about politics, it was deeply rooted in faith. For some, the very essence of the church was at stake. They believed that Matteo's attempts at reform were a threat to the traditions that had been the cornerstone of the Catholic faith for centuries. Elon Musk, far away in his sleek headquarters, watched the drama unfold with growing fascination. From his vantage point, the Vatican was at a crossroads, a moment of profound change, but also a moment of profound danger. As someone who had spent his life pushing the boundaries of technology and innovation, Musk couldn't help but wonder if Matteo's mission could succeed. Could the church truly change? Could it survive in the modern world? Musk wasn't just an observer anymore, he was a potential ally, someone who had the resources and the global influence to support Matteo, or to undermine him. But Musk understood the stakes. The Vatican wasn't just a religious institution, it was a symbol of power, a remnant of a time when the Church had dictated the moral compass of the world. Any shift within the Vatican would have rippling effects that went far beyond Rome. Back at the Vatican, tensions reached a boiling point. The old guard, now fully mobilized, began to stage public protests, calling for the restoration of the true values of the Church. Their rallies, full of fervor and religious zeal, gathered large crowds, many of whom were ordinary people who had never questioned the Church's authority. Matteo is destroying the Church, the protesters shouted, waving banners and chanting. Restore the faith. Restore the truth. For every rally of support that Matteo's reformers gathered, the opposition seemed to double in size. It was as if the entire Vatican was teetering on the edge of civil war, with both sides pulling in opposite directions. One evening, Matteo stood before the mirror in his private chambers, staring at his reflection. The man who had once stepped into the role of Pope with such idealism now saw someone transformed, someone weighed down by the immense responsibility of his position. The public's expectations were high, but so were the risks. He had fought for this moment. He had defeated the forces of corruption and restored hope to the people. But the forces of resistance were stronger than he had anticipated. Would his reforms succeed? Or would the Church return to the ways of old, to a time of secrecy and unchecked power? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Tommaso. Matteo, Tommaso said, entering the room with urgency. We've just received word. A faction of the cardinals is planning to call for a conclave. They intend to elect a new pope, one who will undo everything you've done. Matteo's jaw tightened. I knew they would try to do this. It's always been about power, hasn't it? Not faith, not truth. Power. They're well organized, Tommaso said, his tone grim. They have supporters not just here, but across Europe. If this goes public, it could tear the Church apart. Matteo's mind raced. This was the moment he had feared. The old guard had played their cards, and now they were going to force a confrontation. The conclave would be their final attempt to undo everything Matteo had worked for. What do we do? Tommaso asked, looking for guidance. Matteo took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. We fight back. But this time, we do it differently. We will show the people the truth. We will not hide behind walls or in secret meetings. We will bring the light into the darkness. The following days were a blur of strategy, meetings, and counter-meetings. Matteo's supporters rallied behind him, but it wasn't enough to stop the momentum of the opposition. The upcoming conclave loomed large, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The outcome of the election would determine the future of the Vatican, and the future of Matteo's vision for a reformed church. The old guard wasn't just trying to take power, they were trying to restore the Church to its former glory, to a time when the Vatican was untouchable, when the Pope was the unquestioned authority in all matters of faith and politics. But Matteo knew better. The world had changed. The people had changed. And the Church had to change with it. In the days leading up to the conclave, Matteo found himself questioning everything. Was it worth the fight? Was it worth the divisions, the unrest? The pressure weighed heavily on him, and for a brief moment, he wondered if he was the right person to lead the church into this new era. But then he thought of the people, the thousands who had rallied behind him, the faithful who believed in his vision. They were the ones who had given him the strength to fight. They were the ones who had shown him that change was possible. And with that, his resolve returned. The battle for the soul of the church would continue. The atmosphere in the Vatican was tense. The kind of tension that permeates every corner of the city, every shadowed hallway, every sacred space. The air seemed thicker than usual, charged with the weight of a decision that would change the course of history. The conclave was upon them. Inside the Vatican, the cardinals had gathered in the Grand Hall. The large wooden doors were closed, sealing the future of the church behind them. The eyes of the world were upon this moment, watching intently as the most powerful men in the Catholic Church prepared to elect a new pope. For Matteo, the conclave was a battle for the soul of the church itself. The past weeks had been filled with uncertainty. The old guard had done everything in their power to challenge his legitimacy, to undermine his reforms, and to rally those who sought to restore the church to its former ways. But Matteo was resolute. He had fought too long and too hard to give in now. Inside the Sistine Chapel, the cardinals gathered around the altar, each man a symbol of the Vatican's vast power and history. Their faces were grim, their voices hushed as they whispered to one another. For many, the decision before them was not just political, it was deeply spiritual. The fate of the church was at stake. The room was charged with a mixture of devotion and power, faith and fear. This was not merely a religious election, it was a power struggle that would determine whether the Vatican would stay the course of reform, or whether it would return to the traditional, rigid structure that had defined it for centuries. Matteo stood outside the chapel, flanked by his closest supporters. Lucia, Tommaso, and several others who had remained loyal to him since the beginning of his campaign for change stood by his side. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at the doors that separated him from the cardinals inside. But his resolve was strong. He knew what was at stake. "Do you think they'll choose you?" Tommaso asked, his voice low. Matteo paused, his gaze fixed on the doors. "It's not just about me. It's about the future of the church. The world has changed. The people have changed. We can't go back." Lucia stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've come this far. The people believe in you. The question is whether the cardinals will listen." Matteo nodded. "I know. But what they don't realize is that the people have the power now. They may think they can choose a pope in secret, behind closed doors, but the world is watching. And I have the people on my side." Inside the Sistine Chapel, the cardinals were in heated discussion. The old guard had rallied their supporters, and they were pushing hard for a conservative candidate to take the throne of St. Peter. They feared Matteo's reforms, his promises of transparency, accountability, and a more inclusive church. For them, this was more than just a political struggle, it was about preserving their power and influence. But Matteo's supporters were no less vocal. The younger, progressive cardinals, who had long been disillusioned by the status quo, stood firmly behind him. They believed in the change he was advocating, in his vision for a church that could meet the challenges of the modern world while remaining true to its core values. The ballots were cast, one by one. Each cardinal, cloaked in the sacred vestments of their office, walked forward, placing their vote in the small, golden urn. The votes were counted in silence, the tension building with each passing minute. Matteo had seen this process before, but never under such high stakes. The room seemed to grow colder as the last votes were cast. The outcome was uncertain, and all Matteo could do was wait. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood in the shadows of the Grand Hall, his eyes fixed on the doors. As the ballots were counted, the tension in the room was palpable. The moment of truth had arrived. The chief cardinal, an older man with a face carved by years of ecclesiastical politics, stepped forward to announce the results. The room fell silent. "I announce the results of the vote, the cardinal said, his voice echoing through the chapel. We have reached a decision. Matteo's breath caught in his throat. The world outside was waiting. The future of the Vatican was about to be decided. Outside the chapel, the world held its breath. The moment had arrived. The results would determine the future of not just the Vatican, but the very direction of the Catholic Church. Would it remain anchored in tradition, or would it evolve into something that reflected the realities of the modern world? The door to the Sistine Chapel opened, and the chief cardinal emerged, his face grave. Behind him, the cardinals followed, their expressions solemn. Matteo's heart sank. The cardinal raised his hand, signaling for silence. He spoke slowly, as if the weight of his words would bear upon the entire world. We have chosen a new pope, he said, his voice carrying throughout the square. And that man is Matteo Cardinal di Roma. The crowd outside erupted into applause. Matteo's supporters cheered, their voices rising in a triumphant roar that echoed through the streets of Rome. It was a moment of victory, but it was also a moment of immense pressure. The battle was won, but the real work had just begun. Inside the Sistine Chapel, Matteo stepped forward, his heart racing as he ascended to the altar. The room was filled with solemn faces, but there was no mistaking the sense of anticipation that hung in the air. Matteo stood before the cardinals, his gaze unwavering as he accepted his new role. I stand here today, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, not as a man who has won a battle, but as a servant of the people. The Church belongs to the faithful, to all those who believe in its power to guide us in this troubled world. We are at a crossroads. And together, we will shape the future. Outside, the people cheered. Matteo had won. He had reclaimed the papacy not just from the clutches of the old guard, but from the darkness of history that had kept the Church locked in its own traditions for far too long. The people were with him. The battle for the soul of the Church had been fought, and Matteo had emerged victorious. But the real journey was only beginning. The challenges that lay ahead would be unlike anything he had faced before. The resistance would not give up so easily, and the path of reform would be fraught with difficulty. Matteo knew that his victory in the conclave was just the beginning of a long and arduous road. The night after Matteo's election was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The grand halls of the Vatican seemed like a distant memory of their former self. Now, the halls that echoed with centuries of tradition, power, and secrecy were silent, as though they too were holding their breath. Everything had changed. And yet, nothing had truly changed. Matteo sat alone in his private chambers, staring at the vast expanse of the Vatican grounds through the window. The city, with its centuries-old walls and towering basilicas, looked so unchanged from where he sat, but to him, it felt different. The world was different. The challenges he faced were different. The papacy wasn't just a spiritual responsibility, it was a delicate balancing act of power, influence, and politics. For centuries, the Vatican had ruled with a sense of divine authority, untouchable by the outside world. But now, that authority was being questioned, not by foreign nations, but by the very people within the Vatican's walls. Matteo had fought for the position, but he knew that the real battle was just beginning. The old guard that had so fervently opposed his reforms had not gone away. In fact, they had grown stronger in their resolve to undermine him. There were whispers in the halls of the Vatican, in the corners of the city. The challenge was no longer just about changing the Church. It was about surviving the relentless opposition that sought to keep it as it was. The following days were a whirlwind. Matteo was bombarded with meetings, briefings, and letters from bishops, cardinals, and world leaders. Some praised him for his victory, congratulating him on his election. Others, however, were less cordial, reminding him of the work yet to be done and the resistance he was bound to face. Lucia, always by his side, had become his most trusted advisor. Her understanding of the Vatican's inner workings, its history, its politics, was unparalleled. Together, they pored over letters, proposals, and reports, trying to identify the key challenges that lay ahead. We need to act quickly, Lucia said one evening, glancing at the pile of letters that had accumulated on Matteo's desk. The old guard will not wait for you to settle in. They're already planning their next move. Matteo leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him. I know. They won't go down without a fight. They never have. You'll have to act decisively, she replied, her voice firm. You've already made some enemies within the Vatican, but you've also gained a lot of support. Now you need to make sure that support holds strong. Matteo sighed, the weight of leadership pressing down on him. It's not just about me. It's about the future of the Church. We can't go back to the way things were. As the days passed, Matteo met with key figures from within the Vatican. He spoke with cardinals, bishops, and leaders of various Vatican departments. He had to ensure that his reforms were put into action, starting with financial transparency, clerical accountability, and increased lay participation in the decision-making process. These were just the first steps of his broader vision. But every step forward was met with resistance, both quiet and loud. One evening, as Matteo was preparing for yet another meeting, he was visited by Cardinal Giovanni. Giovanni had been one of the most vocal opponents of Matteo's papacy, a staunch conservative who had long upheld the old ways of the Church. Your Holiness, Giovanni began with a slight bow, I trust you are settling into your new role. But I must express my concerns. His tone was calm, yet there was an underlying coldness to it. Matteo straightened, prepared for what was coming. Please, Cardinal Giovanni. Speak your mind. I fear that the reforms you are pushing forward are dangerous, Giovanni said bluntly. You are tampering with the very core of what makes the Church holy and untouchable. The Vatican has withstood the test of time, and yet you seek to change its most sacred practices. You risk alienating the faithful, Your Holiness. We must preserve tradition. Matteo's gaze was steady, unwavering. I'm not trying to destroy tradition, Cardinal. I'm trying to rebuild it. The Church must evolve, just as the world around it is evolving. We cannot afford to remain stagnant while the rest of society moves forward. Giovanni's eyes narrowed. You are playing with fire, Matteo. Be careful. The Church's foundation is built on its traditions. If you break them, you risk everything. That night, as Matteo walked the empty halls of the Vatican, he couldn't shake the weight of Giovanni's words. The old guard was more dangerous than he had realized. They weren't just trying to hold on to power, they were trying to preserve the very soul of the Church, according to their vision. A vision that was in direct opposition to Matteo's own. He had always known that reform wouldn't be easy. But the stakes were higher now. If he couldn't secure the support of key figures within the Vatican, his papacy would be in jeopardy. The next morning, Matteo summoned Tommaso and Lucia to a meeting. The tension between the factions within the Vatican was palpable, and the time had come for action. We need to strengthen our position, Matteo said, his voice calm but resolute. We have the support of many progressive cardinals and bishops, but we need to bring in more allies. We cannot afford to wait any longer. If we don't act quickly, the old guard will regain control. Tommaso nodded. What do you suggest? I want to meet with the cardinals who are still on the fence, Matteo replied. I need to persuade them that change is necessary, that it's not just for me, but for the future of the Church. The people are with us. We can't let the resistance take us down. Lucia leaned forward. And what about Giovanni and the other conservatives? They'll never agree to these changes. We need to show them that their position is untenable, Matteo said firmly. This isn't about destroying tradition, it's about saving it from irrelevance. If we don't adapt, we risk losing the faith of millions. We can't let the Church remain frozen in time. In the days that followed, Matteo worked tirelessly to meet with the key figures in the Vatican. It was a delicate balancing act, trying to bring in enough allies to counter the old guard's influence while keeping his reforms intact. Every conversation, every meeting, was an opportunity to sway opinions and secure his position. But the resistance was strong. Cardinal Giovanni was organizing a movement of like-minded conservatives, and rumors began to spread of a potential coup within the Vatican. The stakes had never been higher. Late one evening, as Matteo sat alone in his chambers, he received a visitor. It was Elon Musk, who had been following the developments in the Vatican from afar. "Matteo," Elon said, stepping into the room with a purposeful look on his face. "I've been watching. You've done a remarkable job getting this far. But now comes the real test. If you want to ensure the success of your vision, you'll need more than just the Church's support. You'll need the world's support." Matteo frowned. "What do you mean?" "The media," Elon replied. "The public. The world needs to see what you're doing here, Matteo. The old guard has the Vatican's internal machinery, but you have something they don't, the people. You need to make sure the world knows the stakes. If they see your reforms as the future of the Church, they'll rally behind you." Matteo considered Elon's words carefully. "You think the world will support me?" "I think the world will support the future," Elon said with a grin. "And you, Matteo, represent that future." The morning sun had barely touched the ancient stones of the Vatican when Matteo stood on the balcony of his private chambers, overlooking the vast piazza below. The square was already filled with people, tourists, pilgrims, faithful Catholics, and journalists, all waiting for something. They weren't sure what exactly, but they knew that history was unfolding before their eyes. Matteo's heart pounded in his chest. The world was watching. This was no longer just about the Church, or about Vatican politics. This was about the future of an institution that had been around for millennia and its place in a rapidly changing world. If Matteo was to succeed, he had to show the world that reform wasn't just possible, it was necessary. Inside the Vatican, the political landscape had grown even more treacherous. The old guard, led by Cardinal Giovanni, had regrouped and were preparing to launch a counteroffensive. They were no longer simply undermining Matteo in private meetings and backroom deals, they were organizing a full-scale opposition to his papacy. "Giovanni's rallying his forces," Lucia said as she and Matteo met in his private office. "We've heard rumors of a public announcement, maybe even a challenge to your papacy." Matteo sat back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I didn't expect it to escalate so quickly. They want to destabilize everything we've worked for. They have one thing we don't, the Vatican's inner machinery. They've controlled the narrative for years," Lucia replied. "But you have something they don't." Matteo raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's that?" "The people," Lucia said with a grin. "You've always had the support of the masses, the faithful outside the walls of the Vatican. You need to take this fight to them, Matteo. Let them see what's at stake. If you can win their hearts and minds, Giovanni won't stand a chance." It was time to take the fight beyond the Vatican walls. Matteo knew he had to move quickly. The world had to know that his reforms were the future of the Church, and that change was not just inevitable, it was urgent. The next day, Matteo addressed the global media in an unprecedented press conference. Journalists from all over the world filled St. Peter's Square, cameras trained on him as he took to the podium. This was his moment to speak directly to the world, to the millions of Catholics who looked to the Vatican for guidance, and to the skeptics who doubted his vision. "I stand before you today," Matteo began, his voice steady and strong, "not just as the Pope of the Catholic Church, but as a servant of the people. The Church is not just an institution, it is a living body of believers, and it must evolve with the times." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. "For too long, the Church has been shackled by tradition alone," Matteo continued. "Tradition is vital, yes, but it cannot be our only guiding force. We must look at the needs of the people, the challenges of the modern world. Poverty, inequality, climate change, these are not just political issues, they are moral imperatives. The Church must stand with the people, not just within its own walls." As Matteo spoke, the media coverage was instantaneous. The world watched in awe as the newly elected pope made his case for change. Matteo's message resonated deeply, especially with younger generations, who had long felt disconnected from the Church's rigid stance on many modern issues. The global response was immediate. Social media buzzed with hashtags supporting his call for reform, and news outlets praised his courage. But not everyone was convinced. As Matteo's message spread, Cardinal Giovanni and his allies in the Vatican launched their own counteroffensive. They used their connections to spin the narrative, painting Matteo's reforms as radical and dangerous. The old guard clung to their traditionalist views, arguing that Matteo's ideas threatened the very foundation of the Church. The next few days were a whirlwind of public rallies and meetings with leaders from around the world. Matteo's supporters organized peaceful demonstrations, while his critics gathered in opposition. The Vatican became the epicenter of a global conversation about the future of faith and the role of the Church in the modern world. On the day of his most important speech, Matteo was ready. This was the moment when everything could change. As he stood before the thousands of supporters who had gathered in St. Peter's Square, he knew that the outcome of this speech would determine the trajectory of his papacy, and of the Catholic Church itself. The Church, Matteo began, is not a fortress. It is a living, breathing body, created by the people, for the people. We must stop hiding behind walls and face the challenges of the modern world. The issues we face, poverty, injustice, the environment, are not abstract. They are real. And they affect real people. The crowd erupted in applause. This was the message they had been waiting for. We cannot remain silent, Matteo continued. We must be a church that stands for justice, compassion, and inclusion. We cannot afford to ignore the voices of those who are suffering. The time for change is now. And I am asking you, the people of the Church, to stand with me. As Matteo's speech concluded, the response was overwhelming. The applause from the crowd was deafening, and social media lit up with support from around the world. Matteo had done it, he had captured the hearts and minds of the people. But even as the cheers rang out, Matteo knew that the battle was far from over. Cardinal Giovanni and his allies were not going to give up easily. They would do everything in their power to tear down his vision of a reformed church. That evening, as Matteo sat alone in his chambers, he reflected on the events of the past week. His heart still raced from the energy of the speech, but he knew the real work had only just begun. His popularity with the people was undeniable, but the Vatican was still a battleground of politics and power. The old guard had not been silenced, and their influence was far-reaching. Lucia, Matteo said, turning to his most trusted advisor, what do we do now? We keep pushing, Lucia replied, her voice filled with determination. We've won the people. Now we need to secure the Vatican. The cardinals will have to listen when they see that the world is behind you. The coming weeks were filled with negotiations, meetings, and quiet maneuvers within the Vatican. Matteo's opponents worked behind the scenes to undermine him, but the global support he had garnered was undeniable. The Vatican could no longer ignore the people's call for reform. As the battle continued, Matteo remained resolute. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But he also knew that his mission was larger than himself. The Church had to evolve. And he was determined to lead it into the future. The days had turned into weeks, and Matteo could feel the relentless pressure of leadership bearing down on him like a heavy weight. The global media buzzed with updates, the Vatican remained a battleground for power, and yet, amidst all the chaos, Matteo could not help but feel a strange calm within himself. It wasn't peace, he wasn't at peace with everything, but it was something more profound. A sense of duty. A sense of purpose. He had come so far, and now, more than ever, he was determined to see his vision realized. Inside the Vatican, the political tension had reached a boiling point. Cardinal Giovanni, still clinging to his conservative ideals, had not been deterred by Matteo's success in rallying the people. The old guard had mounted a fierce resistance. They were vocal, they were determined, and they would not go down without a fight. And yet, as Matteo stood in the heart of St. Peter's Square, surrounded by millions of supporters, he knew that the battle was nearing its climax. He had won the people's hearts. That much was clear. But the final challenge lay in winning the most powerful figures within the Vatican, the cardinals, the bishops, and the Vatican bureaucracy itself. These were the people who could make or break his papacy, and as Matteo stared at the massive crowds, he knew he needed their support to solidify his legacy. The next day, in a private meeting with his closest allies, Matteo laid out his plan. It was time to take the fight to the heart of the Vatican's decision-making process. No more backroom deals. No more waiting. Matteo would confront the old guard head-on and demand that they either stand with him or stand aside. Giovanni is strong, Tommaso said quietly, leaning over the table. But even he cannot ignore the will of the people forever. Matteo nodded, but his expression was grim. We need to make it clear to the cardinals that this is not just a political battle. It's a spiritual one. The Church must evolve if it is to survive. I cannot lead an institution that refuses to change. The people demand it, and if the Vatican's leadership refuses to hear that, then we will have no choice but to take action. In the weeks that followed, the tension inside the Vatican reached its peak. Matteo and his supporters continued their public campaign, traveling across the world to speak with religious and political leaders alike. The media, too, was on Matteo's side, painting his reforms as the future of the Church in a modern world. The old guard, led by Giovanni, had no choice but to respond. It came to a head in a grand convocation, a council of the most powerful cardinals in the Vatican. The stage was set for the final showdown. The question was no longer about reforms. It was about whether Matteo's papacy would survive, or if Giovanni and his followers would succeed in wresting control of the Vatican back from his hands. As the meeting began, Matteo stood before the assembled cardinals, his heart racing but his demeanor steady. Giovanni, flanked by his allies, sat in the front row, watching him carefully. Your Eminences, Matteo began, his voice carrying through the hall, we are at a crossroads. The Church stands at the precipice of a new era, one that demands change and renewal. If we continue to cling to the past, we risk becoming irrelevant. If we do not act, the world will leave us behind. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Matteo could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. But change is not easy, Matteo continued. I understand the fear. I understand the hesitation. But the people, your flock, demand this. They want a church that is not just an institution, but a living, breathing body of faith that is connected to the realities of their lives. They want to know that we see them, hear them, and care about them. He paused, looking around the room at the cardinals who had been quiet until now. Some were nodding in agreement. Others, like Giovanni, remained resolute, their faces hard and unyielding. We are not the church of yesterday, Matteo said. We must be the church of today. The church that is willing to stand for justice, for compassion, for the truth. And if we do not embrace this, we risk losing everything. Not just our relevance, but our soul. The room was dead silent. It was clear that the old guard was not backing down. Cardinal Giovanni stood, his face hard with defiance. Your Holiness, Giovanni said, his voice cold, we do not need to change everything. Tradition has served us for centuries. You speak of justice and compassion, but you forget that we are not just a worldly institution. We are the Church, the body of Christ. We must remain faithful to the sacred teachings, to the foundation on which we have stood for millennia. Matteo's gaze was unwavering. I am not asking us to abandon our faith, Giovanni. I am asking us to live it. To live the teachings of Christ, not just in words, but in actions. We cannot preach love and justice and then ignore the suffering of the world. That is not faith. That is stagnation. There was a long pause. Matteo felt the tension in the room, thick like a storm ready to break. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a cardinal from the back of the room stood. Your Holiness, the cardinal said, his voice quiet but filled with conviction, I agree with you. The world has changed, and so must we. We must lead, not just from tradition, but from compassion. I stand with you. One by one, other cardinals began to speak up. Some reluctantly, others with fervor. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Matteo's vision was gaining traction. And then, to his surprise, Cardinal Giovanni stood once more, his voice trembling with anger. You may have won the people, Matteo, Giovanni spat, but you will never have the heart of the Church. I will not stand by while you tear it apart. But before he could say more, a group of cardinals, including some of Giovanni's allies, stood with Matteo, their support solidifying. The old guard's influence was crumbling, and with that, the final vestiges of opposition evaporated. The vote was taken, and the outcome was clear. Matteo had secured the support of the majority of the cardinals. His vision for a modern, compassionate, and evolving church had prevailed. The Vatican had chosen change. As the news spread, the faithful erupted in joy. The Church had spoken, and Matteo's reforms would be put into place. The future of the Vatican, the future of the Church, was now in his hands. Years passed, and Matteo's papacy left an indelible mark on the Catholic Church. His reforms reshaped not only the Vatican but the entire global Church. The faithful felt more connected to their leaders, and the Vatican became a symbol of progress and compassion. Matteo's legacy was one of transformation, not just within the institution but within the hearts of millions who had longed for a more inclusive and relevant church. And yet, Matteo never lost sight of the reality that his journey had only begun. The Church's work was never done. Each day brought new challenges, new opportunities for growth. But he had shown the world that reform was possible, even within an institution as old and sacred as the Church. In the end, it wasn't just about winning the battle for power. It was about winning the hearts and souls of the people, and leaving a legacy that would carry the Church into the future. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?